Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into some pretty thought-provoking ideas about the BBC.
Oh, okay.
We're looking at this book, BBC Captured, How the Broadcaster Promotes Leftist Ideologies and Environmental Death Cults, written by a guy named Conrad Riker.
Interesting title.
And, I think this might be particularly interesting to you, given, what we talk about and how, certain institutions, they change over time.
Right. Institutions evolve, they're shaped by various forces.
Exactly.
So this Conrad Riker, he's taking a look at the BBC through a particular lens, it seems.
And he definitely presents a very specific perspective, I think it's fair to say.
Right.
He describes himself as like an aficionado of truth and righteousness. He's coming at it from like a red-pilled perspective.
So he's suggesting there's a hidden reality that's not being acknowledged by the mainstream narrative.
Right. He thinks there's something going on beneath the surface. And he's not, doesn't shy away from using strong language. He talks about brainwashing, the emasculation of men, and a war on truth and Christianity.
So he's making some pretty bold claims. What are some of the areas he dives into to support this?
He covers a lot of ground. He discusses how the BBC covers, things like climate change, feminism, even the way they portray men in their programming. He claims that, even popular shows like, Peaky Blinders are subtly undermining traditional masculinity.
Okay, now that's an interesting one. Peaky Blinders, a show about gangsters, and he's connecting that to undermining masculinity.
Yeah.
How does he make that connection?
Well, he argues that the show's portrayal of the main character, Tommy Shelby.
Right, the brooding, complex gangster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, Shelby, he's a complicated figure. He struggles with his, violent tendencies, his ambition, and all that.
Sure, it's a character study, right? A lot of layers there.
Right. But Riker interprets these moments of vulnerability, as the BBC pushing the idea that traditional male stoicism is flawed.
So showing a gangster with emotional depth is somehow an attack on masculinity.
Well, that's what he's suggesting.
Okay, and this isn't just limited to Peaky Blinders, right? Does he see this pattern in other BBC shows?
He does. He brings up shows like Peppa Pig and Bluey.
Now, those are children's shows. So he's saying even programming aimed at kids is pushing this agenda.
Yeah, that's his argument.
I'm curious to hear how he interprets those shows.
He argues that those shows, with the way they portray fathers, like often making mistakes or, struggling to balance work and family, he sees that as a deliberate effort to portray fathers as incompetent.
Really?
Yeah, and he even suggests that a show like Bluey, with a stay-at-home dad who's, often outwitted by his daughter,
Right.
that's pushing a feminist agenda.
So it seems like he's viewing these shows through a very specific lens. Any deviation from a traditional, patriarchal view of masculinity is seen as a problem.
It does seem that way. And this idea that, the BBC is promoting leftist ideology.
Yeah. Right. Which he seems to view as a threat to traditional values.
Yeah, connects to this whole thing about family structure, right? He believes that the BBC is, normalizing single motherhood and alternative family models.
Okay.
And that this comes at the expense of the traditional, nuclear family.
Does he offer any evidence for this? Or is it more of a general feeling he has?
He does cite some, statistics, data. He talks about the rising number of single-parent families in the UK.
Right, which is a trend in many Western countries, not just the UK.
Right, but he links this trend very specifically to feminist ideology.
So he's saying feminism is to blame for the decline of the traditional family?
That's his argument. He believes that, feminism is promoting this idea that women don't need men.
And that this is reflected in the BBC's programming.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're starting to see some consistent themes emerging here. He seems to view any shift away from traditional gender roles and family structures as a negative development.
Yeah, and he very much sees the BBC as, actively promoting these changes through its programming.
And on top of that, he claims the BBC is waging a war on truth and Christianity.
Right, he brings up this idea that Christmas is being rebranded as Winter Festival and that there's an underrepresentation of, Christian perspective.
So he's seeing a secular agenda at play as well.
He even mentions an episode of, a BBC comedy show where a nativity scene was depicted in a way he found offensive.
Okay.
He claims that this is a deliberate attack on Christian symbols.
So he's interpreting specific creative choices as part of a larger agenda.
And of course, he ties this back to his concerns about a globalist agenda.
Right, which he sees as a threat to traditional values and national sovereignty.
He views the BBC as a tool for, promoting secularism and a more globalized worldview.
It's fascinating how he connects these seemingly disparate issues, the portrayal of men in Peaky Blinders, the rebranding of Christmas, into this grand narrative about a cultural shift orchestrated by the BBC.
It's a compelling narrative, that's for sure.
It is, and it's easy to see how it could resonate with people who feel like traditional values are under attack. But it's important to remember that this is just one interpretation, and it's presented with a very specific agenda. We need to delve into some of his specific examples and see if they hold up under scrutiny.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, let's go back to his analysis of the portrayal of men in programming. Let's examine his concerns about Peaky Blinders and see if his claims about the emasculation of men in this show have any merit.
Sounds like a plan.
So, yeah, Riker, he's really bothered by, what he sees as this pattern of emasculating men in BBC programming.
Right.
And he uses Peaky Blinders as, like, his prime example.
Yeah.
He's arguing that while the show might, appear to celebrate, like, this hyper-masculinity on the surface, it actually, like, subtly undermines traditional male traits.
It's an interesting contradiction. How does he square that?
Well, he points to specific scenes, right? Like where Tommy Shelby,
The main character.
yeah, expresses vulnerability, or, he struggles with his inner demons, his trauma.
Right, which, I mean, that's kind of the point of the show, isn't it? He's a complex character.
Right, exactly. But Riker interprets those moments, as the BBC pushing this idea that traditional male stoicism is flawed, that men should be more emotional, more introspective.
So even a show about gangsters can be seen as pushing this progressive agenda.
Well, in his view, yeah.
So any portrayal of men that, falls outside this very narrow definition is somehow an attack.
That seems to be his underlying assumption, yeah.
Okay. And he doesn't just stop at Peaky Blinders, right? You mentioned children's shows as well.
Yeah, he brings up shows like, Bluey, for example.
Right, which, I mean, a lot of people praise Bluey for, like, its positive portrayal of...
Right, exactly. Bandit, the dad, is, very involved, very present.
Yeah.
But Riker sees it differently. He argues that the episodes where, Bandit makes mistakes or struggles to balance work and family life, that's part of a deliberate effort to portray fathers as
Really?
Yeah, he even suggests that, the show promotes a feminist agenda by showing, like, a stay-at-home dad who's often outwitted by his young daughters.
It's fascinating how he's able to interpret these things through such a specific lens.
Yeah.
It's like, any deviation from, like, this traditional patriarchal view of masculinity is somehow problematic.
Yeah, and that, ties into his concerns about, like, the portrayal of family structures as well.
Yeah. He believes that the BBC is normalizing single motherhood, and alternative family models at the expense of, that traditional nuclear family.
He does present some, statistics to kind of back this up, right? I remember reading about something about, like, the rising number of single-parent families in the UK.
Yeah, he cites data showing that, nearly 1 in 4 families with children in the UK are single-parent families. And, mostly headed by women.
Which, again, is a trend we see in many Western societies.
Right. But he specifically links this trend to feminist ideologies, which he believes, are promoting the idea that women don't need men.
So it all comes back to feminism in his view.
Right. He also expresses, like, concern about the negative impacts of fatherlessness on children.
Right. That's a common argument against, changing family structure.
He cites, studies that suggest, like, boys raised without fathers are more likely to face certain challenges.
Sure. But he doesn't really acknowledge, the complexities of these issues or the various factors that contribute to changing family structure.
Right.
He seems to be advocating for a return to traditional family values.
Yeah.
But, without offering any concrete solutions for the challenges faced by modern families.
Right. So, again, we're seeing this consistent theme emerging where any shift away from traditional gender roles and family structures is viewed as a negative development. And the BBC, in his view, is actively promoting those changes.
Exactly. And this leads us to, another provocative claim. His assertion that the BBC is waging a war on truth and Christianity.
Right. Right. He points to, the alleged rebranding of Christmas as Winter Festival and, this perceived underrepresentation of Christian perspectives in their programming.
He uses some pretty strong language to describe this. He talks about environmental death cults and brainwashing, particularly when it comes to their coverage of climate change.
He even mentioned, remember, like, an episode of a BBC comedy show where, like, a nativity scene was depicted in a way he found offensive.
Right, he claimed it was a deliberate attack on Christian symbols.
Right.
And of course, he connects this back to his concerns about a globalist agenda, which he sees as seeking to undermine, traditional Christian beliefs and values.
He views the BBC as like a tool for promoting this.
Right, this kind of secular, globalized worldview.
It's interesting how he connects all of these seemingly disparate issues, from the portrayal of men in Peaky Blinders to the alleged rebranding of Christmas into this grand narrative about a cultural shift, and that the BBC is orchestrating this whole thing.
It's a compelling narrative, and it's easy to see how it could resonate with people who feel like traditional values are under attack.
Right.
But, again, it's important to remember that this is just one interpretation, and it's presented, with a very specific agenda.
Right. We need to, approach these claims with a critical eye.
Exactly. Are there other interpretations? Does he present any evidence beyond, anecdotes and his personal opinions?
Right.
These are all questions we need to consider
Okay.
as we, continue to delve into his arguments.
So let's take a closer look at some of those specific claims about the BBC's, so-called war on truth, particularly his focus on their coverage of climate change, right? He really seems to believe they're pushing a fear-mongering agenda, that they're suppressing dissenting voices.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is.
So let's see if his examples, actually warrant that level of concern.
This whole war on truth thing, it really hinges on this idea that the BBC is deliberately distorting information, right?
Right, to fit an agenda.
Yeah, and he seems particularly bothered by their coverage of climate change.
Okay.
He claims that they're pushing this one-sided alarmist view.
What kind of evidence does he offer for that? Does he point to specific reports or programs?
He points to their use of language, like terms like climate crisis and existential threat.
Right, those are definitely strong terms.
Right. He argues that, it's designed to instill fear and guilt, rather than just objectively present scientific information.
It's true that language can be very powerful, and the way we frame issues can definitely influence how people perceive them.
He also criticizes them for, giving a platform to environmental activists while, ignoring scientists and experts who might offer a more balanced perspective.
So he's suggesting they're only presenting one side of the story.
Yeah, essentially he sees it as propaganda disguised as news.
It's a bold claim. I mean, it's worth noting that the BBC, as a public broadcaster, does have a responsibility to inform the public about important issues. And, climate change definitely falls into that category. They're not necessarily engaging in brainwashing just by, presenting scientific evidence that supports the reality of climate change.
But Riker's argument is that they go beyond, just reporting the facts.
Okay.
He says they use, emotionally charged language, imagery, all of that to
manipulate them into accepting a certain viewpoint.
Right, and he sees this as part of a broader trend. He talks about the BBC promoting what he calls environmental death cults.
Environmental death cults, that's a pretty loaded term.
Right. He doesn't really elaborate on what he means by that.
Right.
But, it seems to suggest that he believes, environmentalism is this dangerous ideology that, threatens humanity.
But to him, caring for the environment is a bad thing.
Well, he definitely views it, as a key component of this globalist agenda he's so concerned about.
Right. We've talked about that.
He sees the BBC's focus on climate change as part of a larger effort to promote globalism and, undermine national sovereignty.
He even ties it to the Great Reset, right? That conspiracy theory about global elites using the pandemic to, implement a new world order.
Right, he does. And so once again, we see how he connects these seemingly disparate issues, into this grand narrative about this sinister plot to reshape society.
A narrative that really plays on fear and distrust of institutions.
Right. And it's important to recognize that these terms, globalist agenda, the Great Reset, they're often used in a way that's intended to be divisive and alarmist.
Right. They're often used to demonize anyone who, supports international cooperation or, advocates for policies that address global issues.
So it's important to be aware of that context when you're evaluating these claims.
Absolutely. And to really consider the source of the information, to critically evaluate the evidence that's being presented.
Right. And that's something we always encourage our listeners to do.
Always.
Don't just accept what you hear at face value, especially when it comes to, these complex and controversial issues.
Do your own research.
Right. Seek out multiple perspectives.
Exactly.
Form your own conclusions.
And remember, critical thinking doesn't mean rejecting everything you hear.
Right.
It means carefully considering the information, identifying potential bias,
Right.
weighing the evidence.
Exact. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to touch on one final aspect of Riker's argument. He seems to believe that, this alleged agenda, it's had a negative impact on the quality of the BBC's programming, particularly like when it comes to comedy and satire.
Okay.
He argues that, political correctness has effectively killed comedy,
That's a common critique.
that it's created this culture of fear and like self-censorship among comedians.
Right, so no one wants to say anything that might offend anyone.
Right, and he believes that the BBC, in their effort to avoid offending anyone, has stifled creativity.
So he's saying it's led to a decline in truly funny and thought-provoking satire.
Yeah. He points to, the cancellation of certain shows, like remember Popetown, the animated satire?
Oh yeah, that was controversial.
Right, he sees that as evidence of this trend.
That they're more concerned with, appeasing special interest groups than with promoting, edgy and insightful comedy.
Exactly.
It's an interesting point. I mean, has the fear of being canceled led to a decline in, daring and subversive comedy? It's a question worth considering.
Right, and Riker certainly believes so. And he sees it as like a symptom of this broader cultural shift that he finds deeply troubling. He argues that this trend, it's indicative of like a growing intolerance of dissenting viewpoints and, a shrinking space for free expression.
And he sees the BBC, with its alleged leftist bias and, obsession with political correctness as a symbol of this cultural decline.
Right, and he really calls on his readers to, fight back against this perceived threat.
To challenge the BBC's narrative, to seek out alternative sources of information.
He even suggests that, a cultural revolution might be necessary to, reclaim our institutions and restore our freedom.
That's a pretty strong call to action.
It is. And while it's, it's important to be engaged, informed citizens, it's also crucial to, approach these issues with a sense of balance and responsibility.
Right. We need to, promote respectful dialogue.
Right.
Avoid resorting to inflammatory rhetoric or extreme measures.
Exactly. Now, as we wrap up our deep dives today, I want to leave you with this thought. If Riker's claims about the BBC have any merit, what are the implications for, individuals who rely on it for information and entertainment?
That's a good question.
Right. Is it possible to, consume media critically, recognizing potential biases, but still, enjoying the content?
Right. How do we balance our right to freedom of expression with, our responsibility to be mindful of the impact of our words?
Right.
These are complex questions.
They are, and there are no easy answers.
But they're definitely questions worth wrestling with as we, navigate this increasingly complex and challenging media landscape.
Right.
And if you're interested in, exploring Riker's arguments in more detail and, drawing your own conclusions, you can find his book, BBC Captured, available for purchase on, Amazon Kindle and Google Playbook.
Remember, approach the material critically, question everything, and form your own opinion.
That's the most important thing.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See ya.